The advertisement had been nailed to the post office door since the first frost, and by the time she read it, the paper had gone soft at the corners from the cold. It said simply, "Housekeeper needed, winter term, county sheriff's residence, room and meals provided, apply in person." No name, no pleasantries. The kind of notice written by someone who had learned that elaboration invited the wrong sort of response. She read it twice, then folded it into her coat pocket, though she had already decided. The road to the sheriff's house ran 3 miles north of town, along a creek bed that had gone shallow and gray with the season. She walked it in the early afternoon when the light was still generous, her bag in one hand, and her mother's sewing kit tucked under her arm in its tin box, the way she always carried it, as though setting it down somewhere might mean she could not retrieve it again. The land on either side was open, scrub grass gone to straw, a few dead willows crouched along the water, fence posts leaning in pairs like old men consoling each other. She noted these things the way she noted everything, quietly, without conclusion, filing them away for later. The house appeared before she expected it. It was larger than the advertisement suggested, 2 stories of weathered board, a stone foundation, a porch with one of its posts wrapped in a rusted length of wire someone had meant to use for something and never had. The barn behind it was the better structure of the two. She could see that at a distance. The house had the particular stillness of a place that had been managed rather than lived in for some time. Not neglect exactly, more like maintenance performed without affection. The wood was sound, the roof line straight, but there were no curtains in the lower windows, no boot scraper at the door, no indication that the person inside thought of the threshold as a place that deserved any kind of ceremony. She climbed the porch steps and knocked. He answered quickly, which told her he had seen her coming. He was taller than she had estimated from his silhouette in the window, with the particular posture of a man accustomed to filling doorways, not broad, but present in a way that made her register the geometry of the space between them. His hair was dark and beginning to go at the temples. His face was the kind that did not advertise what it was thinking, which she recognized as a practiced thing, learned and maintained the way you maintain a fence, deliberately, against constant pressure. He looked at the advertisement in her hand. She had taken it out of her pocket without realizing it. She said she had come about the position. He said she should come in out of the cold, which was not exactly an invitation, but functioned as one. She stepped inside. The interior confirmed what the outside suggested. The kitchen was large and utilitarian, the table scarred but level, the cast iron range well seasoned and in good repair. Someone had known how to tend a fire here once. The parlor, which she glimpsed through the open door, held a desk buried under paper and a single chair pulled close to it, and nothing else. No rug, no lamp on the side table. The lamp was on the desk, where the work was. She filed that away too. He asked her name, and she gave it. He did not offer his, though she already knew it. The county was small enough that the sheriff's name was simply part of the landscape, like the name of the creek or the eastern ridge. He asked if she had kept house before. She said she had, for her father and her 2 brothers after her mother passed, for 7 years, and before that alongside her mother for the 7 before that. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of disbelief, but of arithmetic. He was calculating something, she thought, and letting the numbers settle. He said the position ran through March, or until the ground was workable again, whichever came later. He said there were no other staff. He said he kept irregular hours. He said the previous woman had left in October and had not explained herself, and he did not intend to ask the same questions twice. She understood this to mean, "Tell me now if there is a thing that will send you away." She told him there was not. He studied her for a moment, not unkindly, but without the performance of warmth, and said she could start in the morning. She walked back to town in the last of the afternoon light, and gave notice at the rooming house by supper. The first week she did not speak unless spoken to, and he did not speak often. She learned the house the way she learned most things, by moving through it slowly and paying attention. The kitchen had its own logic, which she respected before she altered it. Pots hung in the order of their weight, not their size. This was someone else's system, and it was sensible, so she kept it. The root cellar held enough to last the winter if managed carefully. Half a side of salt pork, turnips and potatoes in good condition, dried beans in 3 kinds, 2 crocks of preserved onion, a half shelf of her predecessor's put-up corn relish. She took inventory without moving anything, just standing in the cold of the cellar and looking, the way you stand in a room after someone has left it and try to understand them by what they chose to keep. The range needed a proper cleaning, which took most of the first morning. She blacked it after, and when she lit it again at noon, the kitchen warmed in a different way, more evenly, less grudging. He came in at midday and stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway. She did not look up from the bread she was shaping. He poured his own coffee and did not comment on the heat, but she noticed that he stayed a few minutes longer than he needed to before going back to his desk. His habits accumulated around her like sediment. He was up before light, always, moving through the house with the quiet competence of a man who had learned not to require the world to be awake before him. He ate without comment, which she came to understand as a kind of respect rather than indifference. He was not a man who complimented meals he hadn't earned the right to criticize. He left his boots outside on cold mornings, but brought them in before real dark, when the temperature dropped hard. He did not pile dishes in the sink. He rinsed them and set them to one side, which was a consideration she had not expected. He kept the fire in his study stoked through the night, which told her he worked late, and she began leaving the coffee warm on the back of the range rather than letting it go cold and bitter as she had the first few days. He did not acknowledge this adjustment, but the pot was always empty by morning. She had her own small room off the kitchen, with a narrow window that looked north toward the ridge. She unpacked her bag completely on the first night, which was a thing she had not done in some years, and set her mother's tin sewing kit on the windowsill where it caught what light there was. The room was cold until she stuffed the gap under the door with a length of old cloth she found in the rag drawer, and after that, it was bearable. She slept well, which surprised her. The house was quiet in a way that felt settled rather than empty, and that was a distinction she had not expected to find. The weather came in the second week. Not the first cold. They'd had that since October, the kind that bites at the ears and turns the mud to iron. But the real weather, the kind that arrives with intention and stays. It came from the northwest at midday, the sky going from pewter to charcoal in the time it took her to carry 2 loads of wood from the lean-to, and by nightfall it was a proper storm, the wind finding every gap in the siding, the windows going opaque with driven snow. She had already moved extra wood inside. She had checked the fire in the parlor and the one in the study, and banked both to last through the night without tending. She had made a pot of beans with the last of the salt pork and a pan of cornbread, and when he came in from the barn, snow-caked and moving like a man who had been leaning into wind for an hour, the kitchen was warm and there was food on the table and a dry towel folded on the chair nearest the range. He sat down and pulled off his wet gloves and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her, once, briefly, and she was already turned back to the stove. He ate. She ate at the other end of the table, as she always did, with the practical separation they had both understood from the first day to be the correct shape of things. The wind made the house speak in all its joints, and they ate without words, and it was not uncomfortable. After supper, he said, without preamble, "The mare is close." She asked how close, and he said, within the week if the cold didn't push it sooner. She asked if he needed help in the barn at night, and there was a pause. Not long, but deliberate. The pause of a man adjusting to a question he hadn't anticipated in the form it arrived. He said he'd manage. She said she knew, and that she was offering anyhow. He looked at her again with that flat, unperformative attention, and said he'd let her know. The foal came on the 4th night of the storm. She heard him moving through the kitchen at 2 a.m, and was up before he reached the door. She did not ask. She put on her coat and her boots, and followed him out with the lantern already lit, and he did not tell her to go back inside. The foaling took 3 hours. The mare was working hard, and it went wrong in the last part. the foal positioned badly, presenting at an angle that would have ended things without intervention. And she had done this before, with cattle, not horses, but the principle held. The body's logic is the body's logic. She moved without being asked to move, and he made room for her without being asked to make room. And between them they worked in the yellow lamplight with the storm pressing at the barn walls, and the mare's breath going in great clouds, and the straw warm beneath their knees, and the cold at their backs. He handed her things before she asked for them. She noticed this, the way he anticipated need without drama, without the performance of helpfulness, just the quiet extension of the right tool at the right moment. This was not a thing she had expected of him, and she added it to what she knew the way you add a stone to a wall that is already standing. Not for structure, but for truth. The foal arrived wet and furious and improbable at approximately 4 a.m, and they sat back in the straw and watched it try to understand its own legs, and the mare turned to nose at it with the particular authority of a creature that had accomplished something enormous and was prepared now to manage its consequences. She stood up and pressed her hands against her knees and looked at the foal finding its feet, leaned and fell, leaned and fell, leaned and briefly stood before folding again. And then she looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite what she had catalogued in him before. Not the measuring look, not the flat professional attention he kept over everything like a good coat kept over weather. Something else, the precondition of another expression, something that lived behind the steadiness and pressed at it briefly, the way water presses at ice from below before the thaw has come, and then it was replaced by steadiness again before it had fully arrived anywhere. He said, "Good work." Plain as that, the way he said everything. She said, "Likewise." Plainer. They walked back through the storm to the house, the wind reduced to a hiss now, the worst of it past, snow still falling but without conviction. She hung her coat and started the fire up again from the banked coals, and he stood at the range while the heat built, and neither of them spoke about the barn or the foal or the 3 hours in the straw, but something had shifted in the architecture of the house, in the way they occupied the same space, and they both understood this without needing it confirmed, and neither acknowledged it, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. December settled into its routine, and the routine became its own kind of language. She learned which floorboards to avoid when she was up early, and he was still sleeping, not out of obligation, but out of consideration, the same way she learned that he took his coffee with nothing in it, and that he ate whatever was put before him without complaint, but that he ate more of the bean dishes than the others, which told her something about his childhood she didn't need confirmed. He was not a man who grew up with a great deal, and he was not a man who disguised this. She found that she liked that about him, the plainness of it, the absence of any performance of want. He learned that the tin sewing kit on her windowsill was not to be moved or mentioned. She did not know exactly when he had learned this. She had never said it, but he knew it, and that told her he had been paying attention with the same quality of attention she had been directing at him, which was not precisely the same as comfort, but was in the same family as comfort, and she held it with appropriate care. His deputy came twice a week. He was a young man named Thomas. She did not use the name aloud, but learned it from the paperwork on the sheriff's desk, which she moved carefully when dusting and replaced exactly. And he had the particular earnestness of a young man who wanted very badly to be good at a hard thing. He tracked mud and left his gloves in different places each time, and asked questions that revealed he thought the sheriff's silence was severity rather than nature. She fed him when he came, because that was what the kitchen was for, and she watched the way the sheriff managed him, never warm, never cruel, just patient with the patience of someone who had decided a person was worth the trouble and was prepared to demonstrate this through time rather than declaration. She filed this away. It was consistent with everything else. There was a night in mid-December when she was mending a bridle at the kitchen table, the same one from the barn, a buckle worn loose, and he came in from his study and stood in the doorway for a moment without explanation. She went on with the mending. He was a man who moved through his own house as though he had filed an application to be there and was waiting to hear back, and she had learned not to treat his hesitations as questions requiring answers. He poured water and stood at the window looking out at the dark yard, and then he said, still looking out, "You're not from here." It was not a question. She said she was from 60 miles south, a homestead that wasn't a going concern anymore. He said, "What happened to it?" She said, "Winter, mostly, and some years of hard luck before that." She said it the way you say a thing that is true, and has been true long enough that you can say it level. The grief was still there. Grief of that kind didn't leave, she knew. It just got carried differently, became part of how you stood rather than a weight you set down. But it was quiet grief now, the kind that had made its peace with coexisting. He turned from the window. He looked at her with that flat attention, and then he looked at the tin box on the windowsill, visible from where he stood, and he did not ask about it. That restraint was one of the things about him she was most careful not to think about directly, the way you don't look directly at something bright for fear of losing the ability to see it at all. He said, "This is better work than the place deserved from you." She looked up from the bridle then, because that was a thing that wanted looking up for. He was already turning toward the study, already moving away from whatever he'd said, as though he could leave it behind him in the kitchen and retrieve it later, or not at all. She listened to his footsteps cross the parlor. She went on with the mending and turned his words over in her mind with the same care she brought to everything, held them at different angles to see what light they caught. And when she went to her room later, she lay in the dark and thought, "He is not a man who says things he does not mean to say." She filed that away as something important. January was the true winter, cold that was not weather but geography, not an event but a condition of the place, settled and permanent as the ridge itself. The creek froze solid enough to drive a wagon across. The ridge to the north disappeared into a sky the color of old iron, and for 3 days it did not properly get light, just a pale thinning of the dark around midday that passed for noon and then dark again. She kept the fires and kept the stores and learned to tell by the quality of the silence what the temperature was doing outside. There was a particular quality of stillness that arrived below 15 degrees, a kind of held breath in the air that the wood and the windows seemed to share. The foal was young enough that she worried about it in the deep cold, but he had insulated that corner of the barn in October before she arrived, stacking bales on 3 sides, and she found this when she discovered it during her daily inventory of the barn and thought, "He planned for this, before anything was born, before there was anything yet to protect." She thought about that, too. He was gone for 4 days in the second week of January on county business, a dispute in the eastern township, something to do with a claim, and she managed the house and the barn alone. She did not find this difficult. She had been managing things alone for most of her adult life, and the house and barn had their own logic by now, a logic she had learned through enough repetition to trust. The deputy, Thomas, came on the second day, found the house empty of the sheriff, and looked at her with the startled expression of someone who had not fully credited her existence before. She told him when the sheriff was expected back and offered him dinner, which he accepted with the transparent relief of a young man whose domestic circumstances were not in good order. When the sheriff returned on the 4th evening, she had supper ready and a good fire and nothing said about the 4 days. He sat down at the table and looked at the kitchen. The fire, the banked stove, the swept floor, the stacked wood by the door, the stew on the range. And she could see him taking the inventory of it. She recognized the posture, the slight, still quality of genuine attention. She had done the same thing on the first day, standing in the cold cellar and reading the jars and crocks the way you read the last entry in a ledger. He said, "Everything all right?" She said, "Yes." He nodded and reached for his fork and ate, and that was that. Except that after supper, he went to the barn and came back with an extra length of canvas and tacked it over the gap in her window that had been admitting a thread of cold, which she had not mentioned to him, but which he had apparently noticed on some earlier occasion and held in mind until he could address it. She did not thank him. He did not indicate that thanks were expected. It was a transaction in the currency they had both, without discussion, decided was sufficient. Not charity, not service, just the reciprocal attention of two people who had agreed, without words, to notice each other and to act on what they noticed. There was a young woman who came to the door in late January, one of the families from the homesteads to the east, come to ask the sheriff about a land matter, and she waited in the kitchen while he was occupied. She was 20 or so, with the wind-burned face of someone who had spent the season outdoors, and the look of a person who had recently had something taken from her that she could not get back. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room the way you look at a room that you recognize as well managed, and she said, plainly, that it looked like someone lived here now. She said it like it was something. Like it meant something beyond itself. She set a cup of hot water in front of the young woman and did not respond to the observation directly, but she held it in her mind afterward, examined it the way she examined the things she filed away. The house had been managed before she arrived. Now it was lived in. She wasn't sure exactly when the difference had happened. February came with a false warmth, 3 days of relative mildness that pulled the birds out and started the sap moving before the cold returned with a kind of vindictiveness, dropping overnight by 30 degrees, coating everything in ice and breaking 2 branches off the cottonwood by the barn. She heard the second one go in the night, a crack like a rifle shot, and was up before she had decided to be up, moving through the dark kitchen, and she nearly ran into him in the parlor doorway, both of them up and in coats and already moving toward the source of the sound. They stood in the cold outside and looked at the fallen branches and the ice-glazed yard. He went to check the barn. The sound had been close enough to concern him, and came back saying the horses were only spooked, nothing structural had come down on the roof. They stood on the porch in the dark, the cold ferocious and clear, and above the ridge the sky was showing its full depth, stars laid out in the dense cold the way they only appeared in deep winter, with that particular quality of being simultaneously distant and present. She did not know how long they stood there. Long enough for the initial alarm to settle, for the cold to move from unpleasant to interesting, for the silence to become comfortable in a way that it had not always been. He said, quietly, as though completing a sentence started long before, "I had a wife." She waited. He said, "She went south in the spring of 1881. Said she wasn't built for this country." He paused. Said she was right. She said nothing, because nothing was what that wanted. She stood beside him and looked at the stars and let the statement be what it was. Not a confession, not an appeal, just a fact offered with the same plainness with which he offered everything. And after a while they went back inside, and she banked the fires and went to her room, and lay in the dark with her hand resting flat on the lid of her mother's tin box, and listened to the house settle. She thought, he is not a man who says things he does not mean to say. She filed that away too. March came the way it always did in that country, not as a relief, but as a renegotiation. The cold didn't leave, it simply ceased to be absolute. The creek thawed from the middle and refroze at the edges, and thawed again, and ran muddy and high for 3 days before settling into something that resembled its normal self. The ridge reappeared from behind the iron sky. The cottonwood put out the cautious green of buds that were prepared to be disappointed. The foal had grown into a leggy, curious animal with an opinion about everything, and she had taken to spending part of each morning with it while she was doing the barn work, and it had taken to following her with the particular attachment of a young creature that does not distinguish between the person who helped it into the world and the person who feeds it now, treating both as equally responsible for its existence. He had watched this from the barn door one morning without commenting, and when she came in for breakfast, he had poured her coffee without being asked, which he had never done before, and she had taken the cup without comment, and that, too, was a kind of conversation. On the 1st of March, he told her the ground might be workable by the 20th, or by the end of the month at the latest. He said it carefully, watching her face. She said she understood, and her face was arranged in its usual order, and she could feel him deciding what to do with that. He said, "There's no obligation." He set it to the table. She said she knew. She drank her coffee. 2 days later he rode into town and came back in the afternoon with a length of new curtain fabric, white with a small figured pattern, which he set on the kitchen table without explanation and went back out to the barn. She held it up to the window, and the late afternoon light came through it and threw a pale pattern on the floor. She folded it and put it away in the drawer and sat with it there for the better part of a day before she cut it and hemmed it and hung it on the lower windows. He said nothing about the curtains. She said nothing about the curtains. The house was different with them, and they both knew this, and it was the kind of thing that did not need naming. She wrote no letter home because there was no home to write to. But she sat one evening in early March with a pen and a sheet of paper and thought about what she might say if there were. She thought she might say, "The work is sound, and so is the man, and the country is hard but honest, and I have been in worse places, and this is not one of them." She thought she might say, "I am not afraid here, and I had forgotten what that was like." She thought she might say, "There is a foal in the barn that follows me, and a deputy who tracks mud, and a man who fixes gaps in windows without being asked and says true things without decoration, and I think this might be something, though I am careful not to name it before it names itself." She did not write the letter. She put the pen down and went to check the range, and then checked the barn one last time, and the foal leaned its warm head against her shoulder, and the cold outside pressed at the walls, and the lamp in the study window threw its amber light across the yard, and she stood in the barn door for a moment and looked at that light, a single warm point against the dark and the cold, and then she went inside. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and she said, "The foal's good." He said, "Good." She took off her coat and hung it on its hook and went to the kitchen and started the water for washing up. She heard him push back from the desk. She heard him in the parlor, banking the fire there. And then she heard him in the kitchen doorway, and she turned. And he was standing with his arms loosely at his sides and his face arranged in a way she had not seen precisely before. The restraint still there, always there, but something else running alongside it like a second current in a river that does not disturb the surface, but moves the whole thing from beneath. He said, "I'd like you to stay on." Past March. She turned back to the basin. She was quiet for a moment, and it was not the quiet of uncertainty. Then she said, "I'd like that too." Neither of them said anything further. He went back to his study. She finished washing up, dried her hands, and went to her room, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at her mother's tin box on the windowsill. And outside the window the last of the winter stars were beginning to thin against a sky going slowly from black to the blue-gray of early morning. And the creek ran with the sound of something that had almost finished with being ice. She picked up the tin and held it in both hands and felt its weight, the familiar heft of it, the dents and the soldered corner, and the slight give of the lid that her mother had pressed 1,000 times. Held it the way you hold a thing you have been carrying a long time and have finally found a place to set down. Not set down like a burden, but like something you have carried to the right place, and now you can let it rest, here, where the ground is solid, and the work is real, and the winter is almost through. 16 years later, a girl who had grown up in the valley and moved east to teach school came back to visit and walked up the road along the creek in October, and the house she found was different in the ways that houses become different when they are lived in rather than managed. A proper boot scraper at the door, curtains in every window, a kitchen garden gone to straw for the season, a barn in better repair than the house, and 2 horses looking out of it with interest. A man was splitting wood at the side yard, older than she remembered, moving with the economy of someone whose work had always been physical and who had made a lasting peace with that. A woman came to the door before she had knocked, which meant the woman had seen her coming, and stood on the porch with her arms crossed against the cold, in the particular posture of someone who has learned to read a road and does not startle at arrivals. The girl said, "I just wanted to see it." She said it apologetically, The way you apologize for a sentiment you cannot fully explain. The woman looked at her for a moment, and there was something in her face that the girl could not quite name. Not pride exactly, and not happiness exactly, but something that contained both of those and was quieter than either. She said, "Come in out of the cold." The man came around the side of the house, his coat dusty with wood chips, and he looked at the girl and then at the woman, and the look that passed between them was brief and without fanfare. But the girl, who taught school and had read a great many things, understood it as clearly as a sentence that had been written over a long time and in plain language, and which arrived at its meaning without ever having needed to name it. She stayed for supper. The kitchen was warm, and the table was scarred but level, and the food was good, and neither of them said anything remarkable, but the house held the weight of two people who had decided, once, a long time ago, in the coldest part of a winter, to stay. The girl walked home in the dark and thought about that all the way.